My name is Ian Spanier. I'm a Los Angeles-based portrait photographer. Today I'm going to share with you some of my favorite tips and techniques in Photoshop. We're going to start the process in my typical workflow, which would be starting in Lightroom. From Lightroom, we're going to enter into the world of AI, where I'm using a new software called Avado AI to bypass some of the work that I would typically do in Photoshop. This is a very time-saving software, and some of the aspects of this software are really impressed me as far as how I can utilize it to make myself more efficient in post-production. Then we'll go into Photoshop and finalize all our images. Now, there's many different ways to retouch in Photoshop. None of what I'm going to share with you is the only way. So I hope you'll find some value in whatever I share with you today so that you can maybe add it to your workflow, or maybe take bits and pieces and find what works best for you. Get a pad and paper ready, because I have a lot of notes for you guys today. I hope you enjoy the video. Lightroom is my workflow system for cataloging images annually, meaning that each year I start a new catalog with all my photo shoots and retouching folders held within. Let's begin with an image from a photo shoot I did with actress and model Gia, for whom I work often with on a variety of projects, from lighting demonstrations to full-on photo shoots. I'm going to take down some of the highlights as well as the whites, then enhance the deepness of the blacks. Seeing as thematically we have some very heavy makeup here, saturating the image to some degree will also apply. Because I shoot with a zoom lens often, I will always check if my image will look better with the Enable Profile Correction option applied or removed. Finally, I will apply a bit of sharpening and a bit of noise reduction, as I want this image to really pop from a sharpness standpoint, as well as not have a lot of digital noise. From here, I will output the file. Now, something I want to point out early and often is what we all see on many tutorials. I believe too often they are done on low resolution images. It's a cheat code to getting great results, even on the areas that Photoshop and other programs haven't quite successfully given us the tools to work with. One example is background removal when there's hair involved. So many of the videos that I've seen have appeared to have the solution, but in my humble opinion, it's not fully there just yet. It will be. That all said, I bring this up to show why I'll be working with a large file, specifically a TIFF file. I also use PSD at times, but typically I work with TIFF files when I'm outputting a large file. And of course, JPEGs if it's an image that's only going to live on social or websites. Most of the time, however, I work on large files so that I always have the largest resolution file available to my clients. At the time of this recording, AI is a bit of a controversial subject. Some people believe that it's going to eliminate photographers in some way and reduce our work and so on and so forth. Personally, I believe that AI is here, and the only thing that we should be doing is embracing it so that we can better improve our abilities as artists. There are many great time-saving capabilities and options available, and I'm taking the route of wanting to understand AI, to use it more than avoid being left behind because I don't know how to use it. For me, this is about the big picture of wanting a career with longevity, so leaning into the changes and not being afraid of them. A program called Avado AI sent me their AI software, and full disclosure, at the beginning I didn't like it. A few months later, one of the reps reconnected with me and sent me an updated version of the software, and I was really impressed with the changes. Updates are regularly getting better and better, so I jumped on board. So starting off, I'm going to reduce the face shine a little bit. Now, you saw me do this a little bit with the highlights in Lightroom, but this is really dial it in. I'm also going to address the dark circles under eyes. This is something I'm using pretty much on all images, even if it's somebody that doesn't have a lot of dark circles under their eyes. Same thing with the eye bags. It just helps open up the bottom of each person's lower eyelid just a bit in a way that I really like. As I move my way down the menu options, I just pick and choose what applies to the image that I'm working with. Lip wrinkles and flakes is a great slider to address some of the things that I might not want to get in heavy in Photoshop with a lot of cloning and dodging and burning and all that kind of stuff. Next, I move on to more fine-tuning of the skin retouching. The even with dodge and burn is a new advancement at this point, and it's something I'm really finding to be a great way to deal with adding to whatever makeup is done on my subject. And if I'm photographing somebody that maybe did not have professional makeup done, it gives me the option to really shape their face the way that a makeup artist would. Now, you can't really replace a great makeup artist, but this does a good job of finding a nice in between in the cases where you may not have a makeup artist on set. As well, when you do, it really enhances their work. Now, I never want to have an image that looks sponged over. So the textured smoothing is something that I'm applying here in order to still have some feeling of, for lack of a better term, grain to the image or pores in the person's face so that you're still seeing some element that doesn't seem overly retouched. Again, getting back to that idea of subtlety. Now with all of these sliders, you literally can just play. You can turn things on and off, up and down, and just see what works for the image or doesn't work for the image. Notice as well that I'm zooming in and out of the image to really get a sense of what these changes will make. Down at the lower right-hand menu of the screen, you can see there's a rectangle with a line through the middle. That gives you the option to turn the changes on and off. You'll see me do this a few times here. Facial reshape is another new feature, and it gives you the option to make changes to an image you might need to. In this case, I don't really think I need it. Now the eyes, adding some brightness here is something I typically would have done at the end process, and you'll see me do a little bit of it in Photoshop, but this gives me a leg up and makes a little bit less work later on. The options here also are to remove the red veins, which is great. Another painstaking thing that we deal with in Photoshop typically, and this does it with the slider. You also have a lot of options as far as adding catch lights where there may not be, and other enhancements to the eyes. The next step is dealing with the makeup, enhancing it, adding it, all options available in this software, which is great. So I'll typically play around a little bit with things, maybe just push what makeup artists did just a little bit further. I never really want to step on their toes, but it only enhances what they were going for, because really in a still image, you're able to look at things more closely as opposed to when something is on video and maybe you're not focusing in on such fine details. One of the other nice advancements is the removal of stray hairs. This is something that's new this time as well. This really helps save a lot of time in post, especially when shooting on a blank background like this. The other one I really like is the white hair black, and this is something probably won't work on this image, but it's great when you have somebody with really fine hair that reflects white, especially when you're shooting with a strobe, and it just kind of eliminates it, makes it look a lot more natural. The next step will be working on the background. I love the changes that this software has made in terms of getting a much cleaner background. It actually removes distracting elements as well, which is something you'll see a little bit later. But you can see that color temperature wise and some other things are really going on with this background that I don't like. So this gives me those options to change. So before and after, really good thing to look at as you move along, see the progress you've made and what other changes you might want to add on. Once I'm satisfied, I'm going to export it just like I did from Lightroom. And in this case, I'm going to name it slightly differently so that I have a distinctive name to it. Once we have our outputted image, we're going to select it in Adobe Bridge, open it up into Photoshop, and now we're going to make the more fine detail changes in Photoshop. Here's the time where I'm going to go through the entire image looking for anything and everything that's distracting that I want to remove. If any of you ever worked in the darkroom, this is sort of the equivalent of when we used to spot prints for dust. So I'm taking the same techniques that I used back when I used to work in the darkroom and just removing any little dust spots, makeup, loose hairs, anything along those lines that might be distracting to the eye. And I'm doing this with a combination of the spot healing brush, the healing tool, and the clone brush, as well as the remove tool, which is somewhat newer in Photoshop for 2025 at least. So what I do here is really finely go through the image at high magnification. Now, this is going back to the point that I made about what we see online with images that are low resolution. You're never going to be zooming in to 1, 2, 3, 400% to see those fine details because it's all pixelated at that point. But when you're working with a large file, you can make those giant zoom ins and really see everything that's going on in the image and remove those little things. Now, once you pull back out, or if the image never fully lives at 100% even, these are the things that subtly make humongous differences to the viewer. It's those things that the viewer might not even be aware of that separates the image to be a more successful image, once again, in my humble opinion. Now I'm going to speed this part up a little bit just because it's very repetitive what I'm doing. Now, when I work this much in such fine detail, I will pull in and out of the image quite a bit as I need to reference things, just make sure that the changes I'm making are not making too dramatic changes that stand out as overly retouched. But this is something that does take some time, but once you get used to doing it, you kind of can fly through it, and it's somewhat zen-like as you go along. Now, all these changes that I'm making at a fine detail are the things that will really make that big difference once we zoom out of the image. It's hard to think about an image as ever fully being retouched. Quite often, I can always go back and find other things that I might want to change and go back and maybe readjust. But deadlines are what they are, and sometimes you do have to finish an image as close as possible. It's always a good idea to occasionally walk away from your image and then come back to it just to see it with some fresh eyes and make sure that the changes that you've made are exactly what you want this final image to look like. Okay, we'll slow it down here and just get to the end part. So this is a good time to check the software didn't miss any of those little changes that we might have made. And as well, just go through the image to fine tune it really to how I envisioned it to be sort of a clean image in the end, and remove things in a way that it's not overly retouched, but again, getting to that word of subtle and aiming for that always. Now, often when I'm working at this high magnification, you can see everything. So it is a good idea to zoom in and out from time to time just to step back from the image. I also take breaks as I'm retouching, because as you're staring at these pixels over and over again, you start to lose track of what the image is sometimes. So it's always good to check it out with fresh eyes. I sort of feel like you're never fully done retouching an image. You can always go back and find other things to correct or play around with or change. So, with deadlines and all the other things that we face, sometimes it's important just to live with the things you're doing, but definitely check it out with fresh eyes. That's always a good way to make sure that you're not missing any key elements that are going to make the image as good as possible. What I'm looking for when I zoom out are really any elements that might be distracting. Hard lines, spots on the face, anything along those lines that might distract the viewer from the point of the image. You may notice as well, I quite often work with the clone tool at low opacities. This is something that goes again to that subtle aspect, building on something as opposed to taking broad strokes and just working at 100%. Quite often I work at 10% or less with a lot of the cloning tools, as well as the brush tools that I use, so that I can make those changes from a small perspective and not these big sweeping changes. I should remind you always to save your images quite often. I use a naming system. Not everybody needs to do that, but it works really well for me. FRF standing for fully retouched file. That's just something I can remember very easily. So when I'm looking for images later down the road, I know the difference between my final images and the layered files that I'm working on. So again, just going to the before and after, always a good thing to check back and see those changes that we've made and make sure that we're happy with them. Once we are, we're going to move on to the next step. Now, if you took a break like I suggested, let's reopen that image and get back to work. One of the very useful tools that I love is the use of the hue and saturation adjustment layer. Now, it comes automatically with a mask when you open it up, and masks are tremendously useful tools. Once again, they're non-destructive, so you can turn them on or off. You can also make the changes you want to make and then use your brush tool to paint them on or off, definitely in specific areas, which you'll see me utilize quite a bit here. So I'll play around with the saturation, with the reds, with the yellows, the blues, the greens, and all the other channels, just to see if I can get the image to be closer to what I saw in my head. Now, the other great thing with this is it allows you to turn up the saturation in something subtle, once again, like the ring on her finger, which has this little bit of green in it. The other great tool with this is it will help you eliminate some of the color destruction of an image that happens, particularly when you shoot with strobe. You get a lot of color variation that happens. Now, my strobes are daylight balanced, but there's other light that affects the room itself. This is done in a home studio, so it's not a proper studio where we could black out all of the other light elements in the room. So there's a bit of blue in the background that I don't want, and there's also some magenta in the background, as well as her clothing, that I definitely don't want. So I'm going to remove that so that I can get the image to be more black and white in those areas that I really want to have absence of color. Now, the beauty of this is that it really neutralizes some of that color distortion that we got. Now, as I mentioned with the mask, you have the ability to use the brush tool and paint back in anything that maybe was removed. Sometimes I'll use multiple hue saturation layers and specifically go to that one item, let's say like the lips where it's red, and just make its own hue saturation adjustment layer for that. But in this case, I can do it all just in the one. So here I'm going to remove some of the red that I had desaturated and bring it back in by using a lower opacity brush to paint away the mask, which is where the change was made, and bring back that red color. You can see here how it's coming back in as I move the brush along her lips. Now this is a point where I noticed a little bit of makeup is off on the lips as well. So that's something I'm just making a note to myself that I'm going to go back and change later on. Like I said, you can always go back to an image over and over and over. Now, when I removed the red and the yellow, it affected her eyes a little bit as well. And so I'm bringing that back in just in that same technique by using the brush tool and essentially painting away the mask so that I can bring those colors that I want to keep in there back in. The only color I really want in this image is mostly the makeup on her lips and then the color in her eyes and the skin. That's why I desaturated it a bit so that it would be a little bit more of a palette where the reds and the browns in her eyes are what stand out. So as I mentioned, I caught that little mistake on the makeup, so I'm going to fix that now. I'm going to turn off the hue saturation layer so that I can take a look and make sure I'm happy with it. And then once I am, I'm going to turn it off for a moment and go back to the original layer and fix the lips just a little bit. So once again, going back to the technique that I used earlier with a combination of the clone, the healing brush, and the spot healing tool, and the remove tool if I need to, just to enhance that makeup that was done and just fix that little imperfection. Retouching, as I said, you're never quite done, so I see a couple other little things I want to fix. So I'm going to make those changes here as long as I'm working on the base layer again. Now, a lot of photographers like to replicate their base layer and work on an above layer. I've moved away from that only for space saving issues. Quite honestly, I have so many files throughout the year that the memory that's taken up and the sheer number of hard drives that I'm working with, I quite often just feel like it's unnecessary for me to work on an image like that because I can always output the raw file into another TIFF if I need to, or whatever the case might be. So quite honestly, it's just easy for me to work on the base layer as is. Now I caught another little piece here underneath the eye where I want to reduce that shadow that happened from the makeup. My lighting was quite dramatic and hard light source, so of course there's going to be some heavier shadowing. So I'm going in and just lightening that a little bit. I also know that I can address this in the next step, which you're going to see in a moment as well. Now, the next step for me is to create a dodge and burn layer. This is something that I find is a better tool versus using the dodge and burn tool from the tool palette on the left side of the screen. I basically just found that if you create a new layer with an overlay mode with 50% gray, it allows you to really fine tune some dodging and burning, once again, mimicking the kind of things that I would do when I used to work in the darkroom. And it's just so much more control in Photoshop, obviously, because you're not dealing with a time or anything like that. So you can always go and make these changes. Once again, non-destructive, it's its own layer and it's its own adjustment. So to do this, I'm taking a brush. I'm making sure that my palette is black and white by hitting the quick key of D, which resets it from whatever colors you had. And I'm working with a very soft brush using the shift and bracket key on the left side to make it the softest brush possible. And I'm changing the opacity anything between 3 and 6%. Talk about subtle. This is really where subtle changes make a big difference. If you overdo this part, you will see a deterioration in whatever the color is of what you're painting over. But essentially, this is where I will paint in the dodge and burn aspects that I want, jumping back and forth between black and white as my paint that I'm using for the dodge and burn. So I keep my hand hovered over my keyboard. I love quick keys. So the quick key to switch back and forth between black and white is the X on your keyboard. So I'll keep my hand sort of hovering over that as I use my pen tool to navigate through the image and add the changes that I want to make there. Once again, caught a little piece of dust in her eyes, so I'm going to remove that and go back to my dodging and burning. Now, these are the parts that really enhance those changes that I made both in Lightroom and then in the Avado software. And these are the ones that I'm going to call my final stages of changes. So everything was leading up to this, and this is what I pre-planned in my head, but now I'm doing it in the final step, which gives me the most amount of control. And ultimately, that's what I'm looking for, is that ability to control the image to a place that I envisioned from the very beginning. The dodge and burn works really well on other parts of the image as well, not just in those fine details. So often I'll use it over the clothing and anywhere I want to enhance. In this case, I wanted the shirt to be the sort of background almost to the image. And I want those gloves to pop a little bit more. So this allows me to get a little bit more pop out of them and keep everything else on the subtle side. I'll make sure that those eyes are pretty even, meaning that the iris of the eyes is really getting about the same kind of light into it. I did have a reflector under Gia, which was enhancing her eyes. It's something called an eyelighter made by Westcott, and I'll use that with a little bit of bounce light going into it. You can see when I turn off the other layers what the dodge and burn layer is. It's essentially a painting of what our subject is. And so turning it on and off, you can see those little changes that are made, bringing down the shirt and enhancing the makeup to be the best it can be. One more time, I see a couple of things that are distracting me, so I'm going to go back to my base layer and make some of those changes that are going to just help that image not have anything that stands out as distracting. I really want people to be able to focus on her entire face and not get fixed on any one piece of her that might be pulling away from the point of the image. Ultimately, for me, that's what retouching is. It's enhancing an image to get to a place where the subject is what you're looking at, not anything else. Let's go back to Lightroom and take a couple other examples to show you some other techniques that I love. So once again, I'm in Lightroom making the changes to the original raw file to get the image prepped for basically where I want to go. Now, there are other times in Lightroom where I can do some of the things that I could do in Photoshop, but I'm going to do it here in Lightroom because it's just as easy to use it now and get it set up, especially as Lightroom has made some advances that get it closer to what Photoshop is like. So many of the techniques here, you're seeing me repeat exactly what I did with Gia's image. One thing I noticed when I shot this image, and it's in part due to the way that I lit it, but also the subject and what he's holding in his hands, but I'm going to need a mask of some sort to lower the exposure at the bottom of the frame because it's quite distracting, especially with his darker skin, and once I darken the image a little bit to be a little bit more moody for the ultimate direction that I'm going to take this. So I'm going to use a gradient mask in order to change the exposure just on the bottom of my image, and this will help sort of bring that information down. I can lower things just in that area, and again, go and fine tune it more once we get into Photoshop. But here's where I can really set up the file. This is kind of the things that I would do for the image that I send to the client for approval prior to doing the Photoshop work. Maybe this is, one of 50 frames that I shot in this setup, and I'll apply this in mass to all the images. Now, one of the great things in Lightroom is you can sync those changes to a bunch of images if they're very similar. Also, same option is available in Avado. So if you're doing a retouch on somebody's face, let's say it's a beauty portrait, you can apply that same technique to all of your images and then output those images for your client to see. This is huge because if you have an image that definitely needs some retouching, you can get it a lot closer to the final image that's going to be what you end up retouching. And that only helps your client see how great you are at what you do and how good an image can look without them seeing at any point some of the natural things that we all have in our face, freckles and acne and all those other things. So both a great tool in Lightroom as well as Avado. Now I'm going to use those same exact techniques that I used with Gia's image, a combination of the removal tool, the spot healing brush, the spot healing tool, and the clone brush in order to remove any distracting elements, loose hairs, anything along the lines of the things that weren't covered when I went through and made the changes in Lightroom. I'm going to go ahead and speed this part up, just since it's repeating what we've already done, and bring you guys to my next Photoshop tip. You may have seen this with other images. Quite often, especially when you're working with strobe, you may get a moiré pattern of color on certain fabrics. Now, it doesn't happen with all clothing, but when it does, it's definitely quite distracting. So as I'm moving around in the adjustment layer, you'll see that moiré take place even more so. So it's in there. I noticed it when I was fixing his shirt, and this is something that can be dealt with a couple of ways. First technique to try to change this, which is quite difficult because his shirt is somewhat cyan, is to lower the saturation in the cyan and then whatever is opposite of cyan, which is typically a red or a magenta, most specifically magenta. But problem is that if we remove too much cyan in this image, then it isn't really accurate to the color of the shirt. So I'm going to go ahead and make some of the changes that I want to make with this adjustment layer and share with you guys the next way to deal with moiré patterns. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is duplicate my base layer. Command or Control J is the fast way to do that on the keyboard. And I'm going to go ahead and choose a brush with a opacity of about 23-24% and change the mode to color mode. Then I'm going to use the eye picker by holding the Option key down and choosing a color that the shirt, in my opinion, should be. So I'm going to move around just enough to be able to find the color of the shirt where I want it to be to eliminate this moiré pattern that we're looking at. You can really see the spiraling of color where it sort of goes yellow and sort of a lighter version of cyan and then the darker version of cyan. So I don't want to lose the true color of the shirt, so in order to not lose it, I'm going to choose a color that's pretty close to what I want it to look like. I'm going to make my brush really soft, so using once again the shift and left bracket key to do that. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to paint away the moiré. All I'm doing here is really painting the color on top of the image, and it's allowing that blue to come through and eliminate some of that moiré. And all we're looking to do here really is to trick the eye to not see the moiré pattern. Now I'm being careful not to go over too much of the yellow thread or any of the white buttons and change the color of those drastically. Now, of course, it's something that we can go in and create another mask to this layer and remove anything that might be destructive to the image, because this, once again, is a non-destructive layer once we add that mask, which is why I duplicated the base. In my opinion, once we get to this place, you might still see some moiré in the shirt, but it's not as noticeable as when there's different colors. So it's one of those things that we're really just tricking the viewer to not see the element that's really there in the original capture. I'm going to go ahead and add a mask here so that I can remove some of the brush that spilled over onto the saddle. So zooming in, I'll be able to see that I can use just a black brush, once again, to eliminate it. Now I hit D on my keyboard to reset that palette to black and white, because obviously you don't want to be painting with that blue. And once again, back in the normal mode, and I can use 100% opacity here because I am trying to remove something completely. Now I'm going to add that dodge and burn layer. Now I have it set up as an action on my keyboard because I use this on every image that I work on pretty much. So it's just a quick key that I set up as an action so that I can add that 50% gray overlay layer very quickly and efficiently. I'm going to reset the palette to black and white by hitting the X key. And I'm going to go ahead and use another soft brush on normal mode and work with about 6%, let's say. I'm going to go ahead and paint in the areas that I want to deepen any of those shadows, and then paint away the areas that I want to add some extra light into. Some of the sort of dimensionality of the image will take place here. Now, something I noticed as I go along here is that there is some color deterioration in his mustache, and given that that mustache is such a big part of this image, I want to get rid of that. So I'm going to go ahead and step away from the dodge and burn layer for a second and go back to using that same technique that I used with the color moiré, and I'm going to click on the layer that was meant for that. I'm going to rename it so that you guys can see it very clearly. And the technique is the same. I'm essentially taking color away from something. Now, the beauty of working with color mode with a brush, especially when it's set to a lower opacity, is that you can actually remove all the color. So using black or white will give you the option to remove color completely from something that might have some aberration, is really the right word. So it's called color aberration. So basically you can see in the mustache there's a little bit of green, there's a little bit of magenta, all things as a result of the strobe. So I'm going to go ahead and paint over it to eliminate that color discoloration. And then as I do that, I see that it's getting a little darker. It's probably what his original hair was, probably a dark color. I think he probably had black hair when he was younger. And then when I go back to the dodge and burn layer, I can go ahead and whiten that part so that it feels a bit more matched to the rest of the image. Paint over that mustache one more time to dodge away some of that darkness that naturally happened while I was making that change. Now we'll get to the saddle, which we did some work on in Lightroom and set it up. And now I'm going to darken it just a bit more because I really want that to be less of the focus of the image, even though it's a pretty bright part of the image given the color. So So I want the focus to really be on Charles and that great mustache. So everything here is really with the intent to bring a little bit of the attention away from this big saddle, and it was a big saddle, and put more attention on Charles in general. Ultimately, I saw this as a desaturated image or a black and white image, just to give it a bit of antique quality to it. Using the master, I will lower the opacity of the saturation, and that will allow for me to get an image that has more antique of a feel to it. One of the big mistakes I think photographers make is they just take that hue saturation and bring it all the way down. Now, that is not a solution to me to making black and white. Black and white is channels just like color is. So using that same technique that we did with the hue saturation adjustment layer, I'm going to use a black and white adjustment layer, and I'm going to play with the sliders of the red channel, the yellow channel, and any other channels that I've seen will make a difference. So I'm going to change those things to get the image closer to what I think it should look like in black and white. And that includes all of the channels, because we also have some red and magentas in that background, as well as everything else that's going on. Then once I'm satisfied with that, I'm going to make another adjustment layer of a brightness contrast adjustment. Here, I'm going to up the contrast, because ultimately for me, black and white means some nice contrast. It can be low or it can be high. It all just depends on the kind of lighting that I use in the image. Now that darkened the image a little too much for me. So I'm going to make another adjustment layer, which will be an exposure adjustment. And I'm going to increase the overall exposure of the image, and then also move the gamma correction, which will open up some of the shadows to get it more in tune with the original final file. Typically when I work in black and white, I think that it's necessary to have another dodge and burn layer to adjust the image to get it closer to where I want it to be. So I'm starting another dodge burn layer, and I'm just going to bring in a couple of elements that I think will enhance this image just a bit more. Darkening the shirt, darkening the background, getting into the file and darkening all the areas that I can that will, I think, enhance the image more to the way that I see it in my mind's eye. This will also add that dimensionality to the image, and that's always super important to me. We're dealing with two-dimensional image, but anything I can do to give it more of a three-dimensional feel is something that I'm always going to strive for. Now, the reason I work at a low opacity on all this is, again, that favorite word of mine, subtle. It's all about those subtle changes. Once I'm satisfied with the changes that I make, I'm going to go ahead and flatten this file and rename it once again to a different naming convention, just so that when I go to look for it down the road, it always has its own unique name. When you understand light, it opens up the door for you to have a lot of creative use for light. What I mean by that is that you have solutions to the challenges that we face, particularly when we don't have complete control over where a light is placed. The photo trick that I'm using here is intentionally exposing my image for the shadow side. So what in essence comes out in the raw file is what seems like an overexposed image, knowing that I can unlock the image in Lightroom itself. So what I'm going to do is warm up the temperature of the image as a whole, since it's very cold the way that I photographed it. Then I'm going to play around with the contrast, highlights, shadows, and blacks in order to get the exposure more to how I was actually seeing it with my eye, with our brains with that sort of calculate and correct for the things that the camera doesn't necessarily see the same way. I'll also play around with the vibrance and saturation to get it to a point where the image actually looks like it was intentionally exposed the way that it is going to end up here. Now, the fun part about this is that it's really just trial and error. Not every image will be exactly the same, so there's no preset or formula to make this work. It's really just based on whatever the exposure was for the original image and then taking it down from there. Now, I've done this a number of times, so I know where to set my camera in order to get the right exposure that I could then go in post and make these changes. I always tell people, don't ever say, I'll fix it later in post, but there are occasions where I'll intentionally do something knowing what is capable of Lightroom and then bringing it into Photoshop to finalize the image to get it to exactly where I want it to be. As always, I'm going to add a little bit of sharpening. This is really just more to fit my style of photography. It's really just like when you cook and you're just sort of using the salt and pepper the way that you like it. Chromatic aberration is definitely one of the parts of the image that you need to be careful of. So the automatic setting is good, and then I'm going to check the image once I get into Photoshop. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I always do some profile corrections just to check the image that it's set up exactly the way that I'd like it to be. Now, many portraits are made that day with slightly different style of lighting, and the same idea is here, the same concept is here. And once you start having multiple images that have sort of this story that we're telling, by using the same techniques, we're able to take images shot at different exposures but still have the same feel to all of them, and then create a complete story. Now, all of these changes are being done on a monitor that's calibrated. It's so important to calibrate your monitor on a regular basis for different times of day, whenever you're working. And I do use a shield around my monitor as well in order to make sure that other light that might be in the room is not going to affect my monitor negatively, so that the judgments that I'm making are pretty accurate. Of course, I can do masking in Photoshop, but as long as Lightroom has it, might as well set up the image to get it closer to where I want it to be in the end, which means ultimately less work in Photoshop. Once I make my final tweaks, I'll then output the image and then make the final changes in Photoshop. I'm going to go ahead and add a couple more images. I've already output from Lightroom and done my first tweaks on in Lightroom and then output to TIFF files. And I'm going to bring them into that same Envato catalog that I was working on earlier. Many of the changes I'll make here will be the same, but I'm going to share with you some of the other features of this AI software. Next up on my swimsuit model here, Rachel, I'm going to go ahead and make the same changes again, just repeating all of the things that we've already discussed. But I'd love to share with you one of the other great features with Envato, and that is the ability to not just use liquify, which of course it has, but full body reshaping as well. So in the case of Rachel, there's really not much that needs to be done. However, she's very athletic. Perhaps I could give her a tiny bit of cinching on the waist and then maybe make her a little bit taller as well. So having the ability to do these things is quite nice. It's not something I would normally do too much of because I feel like that's really not representing my subject perfectly. However, every so often there is the need to perhaps change the body just a little bit, and it really is nice to be able to do it this way and not push the pixels, which is so much what would happen in Photoshop when you're using a liquify tool, for example. Again, not something I think I would use a ton of, but it's really nice to have the option to do it this way, as when I was doing it in the past, it would always be using some type of liquify or combination of a maybe reshaping through a kind of a crop, all things that really push the pixels a little bit too much versus doing it this way, which is a lot less destructive overall to the image, in my opinion. With our tight face portrait of Gia, we didn't really get to see anything as far as what can be done with full-length images or three-quarter portraits that you do. So here's a couple of those features as well. let's go into the skin retouching, which will also help with once we get to the body and can really affect the look of the overall image when we're not only matching our face to our body, but also dealing with some of the things in terms of the clothing. Once I'm happy with the touch-ups that I do on Kat's face here, I'm going to go ahead and unify the face complexion and then also unify the body complexion, which is also a very new feature here. That's going to help make everything match together and work together well. You do have options here to really change skin tone completely if lighting maybe perhaps changes the skin tone of your subject, or maybe somebody's very pale and you want to give them a little bit more color to their skin or some tan to their skin. It's a great aspect of this software. As always want to touch on the eyes. So I'm going to brighten those up a little bit, add a little bit extra reflection into the eyes as well, since they are quite shadowed and I don't want to lose them. Now this was a case where Kat, my actress model that was doing the shoot with me, did not have professional makeup done. So I instructed her a little bit on what I'd like her to do to be ready, and it was a pretty natural look. But I'll be able to enhance those features a little bit through this software, which is really great. Very similar to what I was talking about earlier with the way that I use Lightroom for an image that I've shot intentionally in one certain way, knowing what I could do in the post situation. And this is very much that way. I'm able to take an image that has the nice pieces that I need and then enhance those pieces so that the final image has a very high quality look to it. Now there's very many presets as well that you can play around with, but in this case I really don't need to do much. One of the hair tools that's in this software as well, I shared with you earlier, which was the remove stray hairs feature, but it's the white hair blackening that I really wanted you to see at one point, and here's a great example of it. Light obviously is touching into the top of Kat's hair, but it's a little bit distracting. So by using this slider, I'm able to bring those tones down and have her hair be much more how I would do it if I was perhaps shading her with some flags or using a net to cut the light from the top of her head just a little bit. One of the other great features in Avado is the ability to do some of the touch-ups on clothing. This I find pretty much far superior to having to go in and manually do it in Photoshop. So even though she's not very wrinkly even though her clothes are not very wrinkly, that little subtle touch of extra help doesn't hurt. Now, here's the part where I would like to bring down some of the highlights, the white dress being the biggest highlight in this image, and your eye is naturally drawn to the light parts of an image, so I need to do some work on that. However, I'm going to definitely need to make a mask in order to do that. Now, typically I'd be doing this in Photoshop, but I do have the ability to do that here as well. Now, there's a number of ways to do this, just like in Photoshop, where there's more than one way to skin the cat. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just paint over the area that I want to mask, and that's going to allow me to make changes just in those areas itself. Vado does a great job of recognizing your subjects in photographs. So you have the option here to choose the person in a photograph, and if there's multiple people, individual people, and then by these defaults, just be able to have these masks already done for you, which saves a ton of time. And as they keep adding to this program, I can only see this getting better and better. Once my mask is where I like it, I'm able to change the exposure just on those areas alone. And this is really great control. And I can set up the image here or just perhaps be done with what I do here. Next Photoshop tip that I really use a lot is the use of a multiply layer. If we open up our image of cat that we already retouched through Vado, I'm going to go in and fix some of the imperfections that we would normally do and go through the whole image, eventually cleaning up all the things that would be distracting, as we talked about earlier. And one of the things that stood out even when I was making this portrait, Kat being the one to point it out right out the gate, was that she had gone to the beach and had some tan lines prior to the photo shoot. Now, if we had a makeup artist on set, we could deal with this on set, and that would always be my preference, not leave it to post, as I mentioned earlier. But this is a very easy way to fix some color imperfections, or if somebody has something just like this where you're having two different skin tones and you want to even out the image so that it's less distracting, this is an easy and simple solution to do that. Now I've already cleaned up most of the image. I'm going to go ahead and take the lasso tool and select the area where the tan line is very obvious. And this can be a rough selection. It doesn't have to be perfect whatsoever. Once I have that selection made, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that part of the image by touching Command or Control J on my keyboard. Once I have that selection duplicated, I'm going to go ahead and change that layer to multiply and then play with the opacity till it gets close by my eye to the skin tone where I ultimately want it to be. Now, this doesn't have to just be only for skin tone. This also works for clothing and many other areas where you might have some color changes happening that you don't like. So essentially what I'm going to do from here is then take another mask, and once again, the power of these masks is fantastic because it's non-destructive and it allows us to paint on or off. If we make a mistake, you can just go back very easily. So once again, I'm going to hit the letter D on my keyboard to reset my palette to black and white. And then using the X on the keyboard to bounce back and forth between black and white as I need to. I'm taking a brush with normal mode at different opacities. I'll play around with this a little bit with a very soft brush. So I'm using the shift and left bracket key to make the softest brush possible. And I'm just going to paint away the extra selection that I made to help blend everything together a bit more. So let's take a look at the before and after. Now, this is something we could also do using dodge and burn. And in some cases, that dodge and burn layer I shared with you earlier is a better solution. So it's really just about having options, and having options allow you to have more solutions for your clients whenever faced with a challenge in Photoshop. Up next, let's take a look at a background removal in Avado that's really fantastic. I made this portrait against a building where I really just wanted a white background, and I didn't have one with me. The door and the window were in my way for all of the pictures, but knowing that I could easily remove these distractions with the click of a button was fantastic. And quite frankly, when I try to do this in Photoshop, I find that the generate doesn't really give you a good rendition when you're working on high resolution files, at least at this point. Now, whether I'm instructing lighting, talking about working on location, or anything in Photoshop, what I hope you do is take some of the things I shared with you guys today to heart and know that not each and every step of the way is how you have to do it. You need to find out what works best for you and apply it to your workflow to get the best of your images. Thanks again for joining us. For PPA, this is Ian Spanier.